You're going to have to get on the ball and start accepting things. You know, when you're losing, because you're losing.
Do you think Ukraine has lost this war?
Well, they've lost territory long before I got here. They lost a whole strip of seafront, big seafront.
US President Donald Trump says Russia holds a stronger hand in talks to end the war in Ukraine. He argues that the conflict Moscow launched has become a big problem for Europe and they are not handling it well. Trump made the remarks in an interview with Politico. He also repeated his claim that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has not read his proposed peace plan, adding that Zelensky needs to do it.
If they don't read agreements, potential agreements, you know, it's not easy with Russia because Russia has the upper hand, and they always did. They're much bigger, they're much stronger in that sense. I give Ukraine I give the people of Ukraine and the military of Ukraine tremendous credit for the bravery and for the fighting and all of that. But at some point, size will win generally, and this is a massive size.
President Donald Trump also weighed in on Ukraine's bid to join NATO. He said there had always been an understanding that Kyiv would not enter the alliance and that this understanding existed long before Vladimir Putin started talking about it.
Long before Putin, it was an understanding that Ukraine would not be going into NATO. This was long before Putin, in all fairness. And now they pushed, when Zelensky first went in and first met Putin, he said, I want two things. I want Crimea back, and we're going to be a member of NATO. He didn't say it in a very nice way either,
Trump also spoke about Ukraine's decision not to hold elections during the war. He urged the country to move forward to a vote and suggested that Zelensky could likely win one. At the same time, Trump accused Kyiv of using the war as a reason to delay the process and argued that Ukrainians deserve the chance to choose their leadership.
Is it time for Ukraine to hold an election, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. It's been a long time. It hasn't been doing particularly well. Yeah, I think it's time. I think it's an important time to hold an election. They're using war not to hold an election, but I would think the Ukrainian people should have that choice, and maybe Zelensky would win. I don't know who would win, but they haven't had an election in a long time. They talk about a democracy, but it gets to a point where it's not a democracy anymore.
Trump also used the interview to lash out at European leaders. He painted Europe as a bloc led by weak politicians who, in his view, can't get a handle on migration or bring the war in Ukraine any closer to an end. He signaled that he's ready to back European political figures who are aligned with his vision of where the continent should go next. US pressure on Ukraine reportedly includes pushes for international concessions. Axios reports citing two Ukrainian officials that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner tried to get President Zelensky to agree over the phone to give up the Donbas. The outlet says Washington continues to press Kyiv on potential territorial concessions in the future talks. Journalists report that American officials are pushing Ukraine to accept sweeping territorial concessions and other elements of Donald Trump's peace plan. Ukrainian officials believe several of those proposals still benefit Moscow. After weeks of tense diplomacy, Kyiv remains convinced that Washington is putting far heavier pressure on President Zelensky than on Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. A US official has pushed back on that claim, insisting the administration also urged Putin to soften his demands. European leaders meeting Zelensky this week tell him the opposite. They argue Ukraine should not make concessions, not to Putin and not to Trump. The pressure reportedly centers on giving up the entire Donbas in exchange for security guarantees. According to one Ukrainian official, the US proposal got worse after Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner meet with Vladimir Putin for 5 hours on December 2nd. 4 days later, Trump's envoys pressed Zelensky for a clear yes during a 2-hour phone call.
Friction point. Still, the Ukrainian official claimed, the US side seemed to expect Zelensky to simply agree over the phone. The US official insisted that the current draft was heavily influenced by input from the Ukrainians, and that Kushner and Witkoff had pressed Putin to agree to some Ukrainian demands. but the whole episode reflects the simmering distrust between the Zelensky and Trump administrations, despite the many hours their teams have spent negotiating.
Meanwhile, the Washington Post reports that Donald Trump's peace plan may be on the verge of collapsing. The outlet links this to President Zelensky's recent comments, where he made clear that under Ukrainian and international law, as well as basic moral principles, Ukraine cannot give up any of its territory, directly rejecting the kind of compromise Washington has been pushing. Journalists at the Washington Post described Zelensky's statement as his clearly public response to Trump's peace proposal so far. They note that Kyiv removed some openly anti-Ukrainian clauses from the plan, signaling a willingness to negotiate. Yet on the issue of territory, both Ukraine and European leaders remain firm in this and that Putin cannot redraw international recognized borders by force. The possible collapse of Trump's plan is not just about Ukraine defending its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Moscow shows no real interest in peace and continues to intensify attacks using so-called negotiations as a cover. Sky News reports there is currently no sign that Trump's efforts to end Russia's war are slowing the fight on the ground. The lack of any sign that Moscow plans to slow its war machine also raises the risk of the conflict spreading beyond Ukraine. Putting a country on a full war footing, as Putin has done, requires massive effort, time and money. But when fighting stops, returning the nation to the peace demands equal focus and energy. If a government deliberately keeps its military on high alert and continues to build up weapons after combat pauses, it sends a clear signal the country is not committed to a peace, only talking about a pause before next attack. Journalists suggest that the most realistic option for Ukraine may be a deal that tries to balance the interest of both sides.
An all-out Russian defeat is all but impossible to conceive without a significant change of heart by the Trump White House and a massive increase in weapons and support. The next best result for Ukraine would be a settlement that seeks to strike a fair balance between the warring sides and their conflicting objectives. This could be done by pausing the fighting along the current line of contact before substantive peace talks then take place, with Ukraine's sovereignty supported by solid security guarantees from Europe and the US.
But such a step, reporters note, would require NATO's key European allies, especially the UK, France and Germany, to shift their armies and their societies back into wartime mindset. That would mean being genuinely prepared to enter the conflict if Moscow decides to test their commitment to Ukraine. Pope urged continued dialogue after a meeting with Zelensky. The Guardian adds that the leaders also discussed the situation of prisoners of war and stressed the importance of ensuring that Ukrainian children are safely returned to their families.
During today's audience with His Holiness, I thanked him for his constant prayers for Ukraine and for the Ukrainian people, as well as for his calls for a just peace. I informed the Pope about diplomatic efforts with the United States to achieve peace. We discussed further actions and the Vatican's mediation aimed at returning our children abducted by Russia. I am grateful to His Holiness for all his efforts to support young Ukrainians. Thank you for this conversation and for all the attention given to our people. I invited the Pope to visit Ukraine. This would be a powerful signal of support for our people.
Later on Tuesday, Zelensky is scheduled to meet with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, continuing his European tour aimed at strengthening support for Ukraine following growing US pressure on Kyiv. Kremlin hides economic failures and war losses to pressure the West. The Institute for the Study of War reports that Russian dictator Vladimir Putin is trying to portray Russia's economy as capable of sustaining a long-term war against Ukraine. Putin also claimed that Russia's GDP will grow around 1% by the end of 2025, with inflation staying at 6% or below, while the central bank projects 4 to 5% inflation in 2026. He argued that Russian economy could gain momentum with low unemployment. However, the Institute for the Study of War reports that the real economic situation in Russia is far worse than Kremlin portrays.
Putin intensified his efforts to portray the Russian economy as resilient and able to support protracted hostilities in Ukraine in the lead-up to the December 2nd US-Russia meeting in Moscow, and Putin's December 8th remarks are likely similarly aimed at influencing the ongoing peace negotiations. Putin is likely attempting to convince the United States that increased sanctions pressure will not have its intended effect on the Russian economy and will not push Putin to make compromises to end his war against Ukraine. Putin is also notably not discussing the ongoing war in Ukraine in his speeches on the Russian economy, likely in order to obscure the connections between Russia's battlefield losses and economic problems.
Experts point out that Kremlin is pushing two-pole narratives: a resilient economy and Russia's inevitable victory. These messages aim to create a sense of hopelessness in the West and Ukraine, pressuring them to accept Moscow's terms. In reality, Russia faces several critical weaknesses, both on the battlefield and in its economy, that could force the Kremlin to make genuine concessions. That's all for now. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your comments below.